Folks, this is Tom Opry, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
My name's Alex Jenkins. I'm the headkeeper here on Edinglassie estate. My job is to look after the running of the estate. We're primarily a sporting estate, a driven grouse moor. I manage the deer as well. In addition to that, I oversee a lot of the grazing aspect of the estate. We conduct all the muir burn, look after the roads, infrastructure, property side of things, and a bit of forestry work as well.
Okay. What is Edinglassie?
So Edinglassie is a 15,000 acre sporting estate in Scotland. Our primary function is as a driven grouse moor, but we also farm in our own right in quite a big way as well. We do have some commercial forestry and some let property on the estate.
So how do you manage this estate, and what is the purpose of managing this estate?
Yep. So everything that's done at Edinglassie is done for the purposes of conservation. We manage, as I say, the hill as a driven grouse moor. There's 4 full-time employees employed on that side of the enterprise. We also do a lot of conservation work on the in-by ground for waders. We plant species-rich grassland, wader scrapes, wild bird seeds. We've planted some riparian forestry, various projects over the years really.
Well, we talked the other day about, how do you manage these properties? You've talked about, kind of explain to me what is a heather moor and how is it managed?
Yep, so the heather moorland here is probably one of the rarest habitats in the world. Britain's fortunate to have about 70% of the remaining resource here. The way in which we manage a heather moorland is through a number of different factors, but rotational burning is a big part of it. We look to try and regenerate the heather through our burning. We're not looking to kill it off, quite the opposite. It's a regeneration process. We're looking for new growth and create a mosaic pattern throughout the heather which benefits the ground nesting birds. We monitor the grazing very carefully as well. We don't graze the heather moorland at all in the winter, and in the summer we're quite hot on making sure we don't overgraze where we can. Our forestry plan as well is probably quite sympathetic towards the hill. We're not looking to plant it, but we have done little bits of riparian woodland where we think we can.
So this area, how much, going back in time, what did this look like 1,000 years ago? And by managing it now, how does it compare to then? And what historically has been here on the landscape?
I'd like to go back 1,000 years, but
that's fine.
Yeah. Historically, going back a number of generations, this has always been open hill, open moorland. It was probably treated quite different a few generations ago to how we use it now, but I think those folk back then would recognise a lot of what we do. Going back hundreds of years, we're looking at a sort of shieling system where the hill would have been utilised for summer grazing, and summer grazing only, cattle and sheep. That's not dissimilar to what we use it for these days. We summer graze the hill only, we don't graze it in the winter. Going back hundreds and hundreds of years, the people would have utilised the deer, the hares and the grouse as a food source and a food source only. Again, I think they would recognise that in us today. Everything that's shot on the estate goes into the food chain with ourselves. But more recently there's been the sporting aspect to it as well, which brings in a lot of income for the estate and has done for a couple of generations now. So that's a big side of what we do these days, which would have been different from our forebears.
Managing the heather moor, burning is a big part. You just mentioned that. Explain to me, how do you manage it with fire, and tell me the process and what it does in as far as what you end up with, and if you didn't do that, what do you end up with?
Yep. So the reason we rotationally burn the heather is really to improve the new growth and the benefit that we get from grazing it. Once the heather gets old and degenerate, it loses a lot of its feed value, it's not as nutritious to the grouse, the deer, the sheep, the hares. So we look to rotationally burn it on a cycle. Now that cycle is roughly about 20 years up here. So we burn off the old degenerate heather, and we take the surface of the vegetation off only, just the heather. It leaves the understory of the mosses, etc. And the idea behind that is the heat of the fire, removing that old vegetation, results in new growth. And it's the new growth that's most nutritious to, as I said, the grouse, the deer, the sheep and the hares. So as the plant, the heather, is in its young life, the tips of that heather, the fastest growing bits, are by far the most nutritious. So that's what gives the most benefit to the animals that graze it. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We look to have 4 stages of heather growth. We've got our pioneer, which is just, you're freshly burnt. You've got your pioneer heather, which is just coming through. We've got, what we would consider the optimum growth of heather, the sort of middle stage, and then it goes into that rank degenerate stage. That rank degenerate stage has its place as well. It provides nesting cover from aerial predation from ground nesting birds. It's also the only heather that pokes through the snow in the winter time, so it's a pretty valuable feed source when the deer scratch off the snow. The grouse then come down and utilize that stuff that's poking through. So we look for various ages of heather, and in our case we do that through burning it.
So how do the animals use it? Explain to me each animal how it uses the heather in the course of the year, and how that's critical to their survival.
Yep. So the heather's the most predominant species we've got on the hill by a long way, but it's not the only thing that the species up here eat, far from it, including the red grouse, popular to a lot of what many folk will think. But they all graze it or browse it in much the same fashion. The way they utilize it is very different. The way they digest it is very different, but they all graze it in the same fashion, and that's really just the new young growth off the top of the heather. The only exception to that would probably be sheep. If sheep were to be left on the hill all winter, when there's not much new growth of anything else, they'll graze the heather pretty hard, and that can be detrimental. So that's why we take the sheep off the hill in the winter.
Okay, so we're talking about the heather, and we talked about burning. Yesterday you talked about the width of how you burn. Talk a little bit about the technique of burning, the process that goes on, and what the desired effects are.
Sure. So the reason we burn these relatively long, narrow strips, or certainly narrow's the key point, is that somebody a lot cleverer than I worked out a long time ago that the red grouse will only graze about 30 yards, 30 meters into the open before it starts feeling a bit vulnerable. It starts looking to the sky, thinking about aerial predation. So if the fire is much more than 60 meters wide, you're really wasting the bit of ground in the middle. We look to burn in small strips, small patches as well, to, as I said before, create this mosaic pattern. Grouse are quite territorial animals. So ideally you're looking for a bit of every type of habitat within that grouse's territory. You want a bit of nesting cover, you want a bit of old degenerate rank heather, you want a bit of young food stuff, and you need a bit of freshly burnt to create that pattern, of course.
Talk to me about the grouse, the red grouse. What is this grouse you have here? Explain to me what it is, what it means to you people, and what you're ultimately trying to do to it.
Yep. So the red grouse is one of our indigenous grouse species. We have the capercaillie and the ptarmigan as well, but the red grouse are probably they're certainly the most numerous of the 3 species. Socially, I think they're probably very important for us in Scotland. Historically, it's been quite a date in the calendar, the 12th of August. It's a big part of the social calendar for us. For the likes of myself, as a hill keeper, they're certainly one of the most important species up there. My whole year revolves around trying to hopefully produce a surplus stock that we can take, and hopefully enjoy some shooting and be able to provide some shooting. It's the economic driver of this area, and it's They support my family, so I'm very grateful for them.
You got a 15,000 acre estate. How many grouse live here? Just, I mean, ballpark idea, and how many do you have to keep over? Because I want you to get into the fact that we have to keep so many for the predators too, even though we man it, you're not predating the stuff.
So how many grouse do we have on the estate? That varies hugely, fluctuates hugely. It's a very difficult question for me to answer. What we look for is hopefully a surplus in the population that we think we can afford to shoot from. It's not in our interest. We look to shoot as consistently as possible, so when numbers are very low, we don't shoot. It's not in our interest to shoot. We count our grouse twice a year, every year, and have done decades now, if not 100 years. The methodology that we use here is we count kilometre squares, and we do transect counts on top of that as well. When we're counting the kilometre squares, as I say, the figures vary depending on the spring. The whole year for us revolves around the spring. It's that key few weeks. You do as much work on the moor as you do in a bad year as you do a good year. We're heavily reliant on the weather. In those kilometre squares, in a year like this where we're coming off quite a low stock, I'm pretty happy with the counts. If we're generally sitting over 100 grouse to the kilometre square, and that's going to allow me for a very moderate shooting program this year. But yeah, in the bumper years when we've got a good stock and they breed well, the numbers can increase greatly. But I don't think I could ever answer a question of how many grouse I've got in the estate. But we know from generations of experience when we can afford to shoot and when we can't.
Obviously, as your job as a gamekeeper, you're trying to get these grouse numbers up so you can shoot, but you're having to, you have an impact on other things have an impact on besides you guys. But I mean, the reality, what is the biggest impact on grouse as far as their survivability? Kind of explain to me what I'm looking at is the weather issues, food, and predation.
So the factors that affect grouse numbers, by far the biggest one will be the weather. We can have a fantastic stock in some years, but if the spring's absolutely rotten and we have a rotten beginning to the summer, they just won't breed. They're a subarctic bird. They're pretty tough, but they're the same as every other species we have in the UK. If the spring's a disaster, as is the breeding success. Yeah.
So predators are a big issue here. So explain to me kind of historically what have been the issues with predators. How do you guys control predators, and just kind of go through the processes of what they are, how you control them?
The second biggest factor affecting the grouse numbers we have here will be predation. Always has been, always will be. It's a fact of the countryside. Historically, predation's always been an issue, be that from foxes, stoats, weasels, rats, the mammalian predators. The avian predation's a huge issue as well. Both corvids and raptor species. It can have quite a detrimental effect. We try and control what we can within the law, what we're allowed to these days. Certainly very keen on our fox control. We control stoats, rats and weasels through trapping. We control the corvid species we're allowed to. Raptors are having an increasing predation effect as we see more and more. Certainly some of the generalist predators like the buzzards, which we were in Scotland unable to control, are seeing huge rises across the country, and that's having quite a detrimental effect on our ability to produce grouse. That being said, I'd like to think we're quite effective at what we do. But with the best will in the world, we've always got foxes, we've always got stoats, we've always got weasels, we've always got rats. There's always corvids here. We are looking really just to control the population. With the best will in the world, we could never ever knock it down to zero. And for what it's worth, I wouldn't want to. I think it's quite a poor hill that can't have a fox on it. They're a part of the hill as much as we are, so they've every right to be here as well, of course.
The other thing we talked about was ticks. Explain to me what's going on with ticks and what the problems they create for the grouse, and the vectors with the deer, and weather changes, heat, and what they actually do to the birds.
if you were to have asked a keeper 3 generations ago about ticks, they probably wouldn't have even known what you were talking about, hardly. And they certainly wouldn't have thought it impacted on their grouse production. Unfortunately, in the last couple of generations, tick have become a huge issue across the UK, and they're a massive issue to us as well. The ticks bite onto the young grouse as a host, as a feed to complete the one stage of their life cycle. The ticks also carry a virus called Lupinil. Lupinil sort of affects the nervous system of a number of species, not just grouse. Everything almost, including deer, sheep, hares, and grouse suffer Lupinil. Lupinil can cause an 80% mortality in young red grouse. In addition to that, there's a human detrimental side effect to ticks as well, and that's Lyme's disease, as I'm sure a lot of folk are aware. Tick numbers in the UK are just growing and growing and growing. Whether that's a result of climate change, which I think it probably is. I think the withdrawal of compulsory dipping of sheep back in the day certainly contributed to a rapid increase in tick numbers. But generally the situation is getting worse and worse, and it's certainly hampering our ability to produce grouse.
Graphically tell me what you find when these ticks, because we've had Kathy talk about these ticks are in these clusters, these balls when they're born, these little baby ticks, and it's not the mature ticks, it's the baby ticks.
Yeah.
And then these chicks are at that same level, and they walk into them, and literally I've seen pictures where capercaillie, not red grouse, but all their eyes are almost completely covered with these ticks and stuff. And tell me what it does. I mean, they even tell me it sucks enough blood out of them that it weakens them till they die.
The ticks can have such a horrible effect on the anything that lives on the ground, really. Certainly in the case of the young red grouse, even if Lupinil is not present, which in parts of this estate is not, thankfully, the tick burden can just be so bad that the ticks blind the chicks. There's so many ticks around their eyes that they're blinded. They can't see, they lose the feather cover around their eyes, around their nostrils, around the beak. It can be pretty horrible to see, to be quite honest with you. If they're fortunate enough to dodge the Lupinil, that tick burden can kill them alone. It can almost suck them dry. If you have a favourable spring, they can weather a fair tick burden successfully, but if you throw inclement weather at them, sideways wind and rain, if not snow, during that early stages of their life where a tick burden like that, they'll almost certainly die. And we have certainly seen it in the past where we've had good hatches and we watch our broods dwindle off to nothing but tick, really. I have friends further north where the tick situation is arguably even worse, who've even found juvenile raptors suffering ill effects of tick.
Being a gamekeeper isn't simple. It's not an easy life. Tell me about what it's like to be a gamekeeper, and what I really am hinting at is, just even the mental side of things. How hard is it being a gamekeeper, and why?
It can be a hugely rewarding way of life being a keeper. We're very fortunate that we get to work up in these environments and do what we do. There's a lot of folk who would be quite envious of that. Having been a keeper now for 20 years, I certainly see the other side to that. Can be quite a lonely existence up here, certainly. You're working on your own a lot. The political pressure on us these days, or the general pressure from the public, is becoming increasingly difficult. We don't seem to be valued, certainly by the government. We've had a lot of the tools that we require to do our jobs removed from us in recent years. The general public perception through social media of us is probably at an all-time low. I've certainly maybe put my head above the parapet in the past, trying to sort of counter that perception of us and try and tell a few of the home truths of what I see are the benefits of what we do. which I see firsthand every day, being up here. As a result of that, I've had some pretty negative feedback. I've had abuse on social media. It's quite uncomfortable, if I'm honest. Certainly, even we're quite fortunate in this area that we're really the biggest industry is the sporting estates, and most people see the benefit to the local economy of what we do and are very supportive of what we do. But there's always that relatively, dare I say, urban.
What is the perception?
The perception of gamekeepers, I think, is that we're stuck in an Edwardian period. That all we do is go to the hill and kill things purely for the benefit of red grouse. So far from the truth. My job is so diverse in what we do. I spend as much time managing habitats, liaising with various government bodies, educating, as I do pulling the trigger. Pulling the trigger and killing things is such a small part of my job these days. It's a vital part of the job, but it's not what I do every day. And I think folk just think we go to the hill and indiscriminately kill wildlife, and it's so far from the case. I think as a profession, gamekeepers are as knowledgeable about what's happening on the hill and the flora and fauna as anybody in the UK. We might not have degrees to back that up, but through experience, through generations of experience in many cases, our knowledge is almost second to none, I would say.
Who are the people that are, kind of explain them, describe who are these people that are working against you and your lifestyle here?
So I think the people that are attacking what we do as keepers are probably a relatively small minority, but they're a very vocal minority. I think if you were to ask 80% of the Scottish public what a gamekeeper does, I'm not sure they would give you an answer, frankly. There'll be 10% that do and are very supportive of us, folk that know us personally, and there'll be that 10% who think they know. I would argue they don't, and I would say to a lot of these folk I'd like to take them up and show them what we do on a daily basis. I mean, these misconceptions that surround us, they're so far from the truth, they're so unhealthy, but as I say, it's a very vocal minority, and almost in the culture we've got of social media and veganism and rewilding, it's I think we're deemed an easy target these days. We're a popularist thing to dislike, and I'd certainly like the opportunity to counter that with a lot of these folk.
You've been doing this for 20 years.
Yeah.
The question is why won't you continue on this? I mean, there's been generations of gamekeepers at this estate. Why are you not going to continue?
Yeah, so there's been generations of keepers in this estate. I personally, after 20 years, have made a choice to do something different. My biggest worry has always been around viability. We're very fortunate as an industry that we have people as passionate as ourselves as gamekeepers who are willing to invest large sums of their own money to little gain, because they are, as I say, as passionate about the wildlife up here as we are. I worry about the viability of the industry if we keep getting attacked the way we're being attacked. I certainly would have to think twice about investing my money, even if I was wealthy, if I were constantly under attack from the powers that be. And it's an expensive business. It's a very worthwhile business. But everybody has to have that point where they think to themselves, all this pressure I'm getting, is it worth it? Do I want to carry on doing this? And I think that's my biggest worry for the industry going forward. We need to get to a stage where we're valued for what we have before it's too late. I don't think we want to be in a situation, even if it's 30 years down the line when everybody looks in retrospect and thinks, you know what, actually what those guys were doing was pretty good. Because in 30 years' time, it'll be too late. It'll be irreversible. We're at a turning point now, and I just hope we can turn a corner in a positive direction. But I have my concerns about that.
All right, but tell me more of the personal side. You're talking about the industry, and that's great. But you sit around at night with your wife, and you're obviously having this conversation. Do we want to keep this? Now you're going to go to a fucking island and, raise sheep.
Yeah.
I mean, who in the world would think that's... I mean, if you're going to get a job at some internet company and you're going to travel the world, I'd be like, yeah, okay, cool. But you're going to Orkney in the middle of fucking BFE to do something, that I wouldn't think that's a passion for you. What are the discussions you and your wife have, and what do you actually say to each other? And how does that... What is the real reason you're leaving?
I won't think about this one.
That's fine.
It's a difficult evening for me because I have a lot of friends who are continuing down this route, and I don't want to seem too despondent about it because I'd like to think they have a future. But for me, it's the pressure of constantly having to fight for our survival that I have found quite tiresome. I've been quite politically involved, certainly for the last 10 years of my career. And at every turn we're having to fight for our way of life. We're having to fight for tools that we want to continue using. And at a personal level, I find that very difficult. I think it's important that we continue to do it, but as I say, the pressure of having to do that all the time just to continue doing what you're doing and making a living is become quite tiresome, if I'm quite honest. And it's everything. We're constantly turning a corner and having to fight another battle. Be it mountain hares, be it snares, be it general licenses. I just feel it's almost a bit like death by 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts. Yeah. I feel it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. I hope that's not the case.
Talk to me about family and how that affects your decision making, and what I'm getting into. What I want you to talk about is, I've got a 4 and a 7-year-old, and I don't.
The family side of things, I've 2 young children, both are primary age. It's quite a demanding job, always has been. Always long hours on the hill, that sort of thing. And I've never minded that. My wife is from a farming family, so she's always been very understanding of that. On the whole, it's been, as a job, going to the hill every day and working with wildlife. It's so rewarding, and it's been a fantastic place for my kids to grow up. In more recent years, as I say, the political side of things, out with my day job, out with actually going to the hill, I spent a lot of my time lobbying, sitting on various boards, our Moorland group, etc. And I think that's worthwhile, but it takes up a lot of your time. I spend, if I'm not on the hill, most of my evenings doing that. It impacts on my family life quite a lot. There's constant political lobbying, just fighting for our future. Maybe don't spend as much time with my kids as I would like to. And I think it's certainly a factor in the decision that I've made is, while my kids are young, I'd certainly like the opportunity to spend more time with them. And not have that constant worry of where we will be in 10 years' time if I'm still going to have a job. So, yeah.
Another interview we did last time we were here with David Belhari, John Muir Trust, basically said that gamekeepers and gillies and steer stalkers haven't figured out, but they're going to be removed from the land already, in the future. They just haven't figured it out. They're just a bunch of serfs. Are you a serf? And if you are or you aren't, explain to me why.
Am I a serf? Yeah, absolutely not. It took me a lot of years to get to where I am. A lot of knowledge passed to me by my forebears through college, through working experience. I've educated myself through reading and, all sorts. I'd like to think I'm as knowledgeable as anybody about what I do. The only way my knowledge could increase is through time. I've certainly listened to a lot of my predecessors and forebearers. That knowledge isn't easily acquired, and I'm certainly not a serf. I've been rewarded by my current employer for my knowledge and my ability, I hope. I've made a good life for my family, well rewarded financially. I've got a fantastic relationship with my boss. Certainly don't think of myself as a serf. I'd like to think that my employer is my friend, and his wider family. No, I don't understand what that man's coming with that statement. Not at all.
So if you're going to quit, are you going to miss it? And if so, why?
Yeah, when I leave, will I miss it? Hugely. Yeah. Certainly, yeah. Going out the hill every day. I think I'll miss the hill itself. Stalking, just being out there. Myself, my rifle, my binos. I'll miss that. Yeah, I genuinely like it up there. And the family side of things for me is key.
The positive side of what
I don't want to get to 50 and sit to myself thinking I wish I'd done that, because this is really getting pretty shit now. That's something I'd like to get across. It's not just, that was a big worry for me. I didn't want to get to that age and not have the ability to do something like this, and physically, and we've got a narrow window where my kids are at an age where we can do what we want to do, and hey, it might not work. I might be back yet. So
thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.